Muito bem. Bem-vindas e bem-vindos mais uma vez. Agradeço a todo mundo que está entrando, que está chegando. A gente vai começar aos pouquinhos, porque imagino que deve ter gente que ainda está entre nuvens, tentando conectar. Vocês estão vendo aí na tela de vocês o Luiz, que é da Escola Schumacher Brasil, a Cris, que está já falando, é a nossa tradutora, o Tim Ingold e o Tim Crabtree, que estão aqui com a gente também, 2 times. E a gente vai começar falando um pouco de português. A Cris, enquanto isso, está traduzindo para o inglês, para o time conseguir entender o que a gente está dizendo. Eu sou a Beatriz, da Escola Schumacher Brasil. E a Schumacher Brasil, para quem não nos conhece, ela começou aqui em 2014 e ela foi parte de um movimento que foi iniciado pela Juliana Schneider e pela Mari Turato e uma rede de brasileiros também e de professores do Schumacher da Inglaterra que nos apoiam até hoje. E começou com uma exploração do que seria possível naqueles tempos ganhar vida no Brasil, muito inspirado pelo ethos do college da Inglaterra, mas sempre aterrissando em terras brasileiras. A gente oferece, então, desde 2014, experiências, vivências, cursos e trocas para uma educação transformadora, visando uma vida sustentável, em diversas temáticas. E o nosso trabalho é muito inspirado pelo economista alemão, o I.F. Schumacher, que é autor de um livro que marcou o início desse movimento da nova economia, um livro chamado Small is Beautiful, que tem a tradução para o português, O Importante é Ser Pequeno. E também, é claro, não sei se todo mundo que está aqui conhece, a gente também inspira muito do nosso trabalho em todo o legado do Satish Kumar, que é um ativista indiano e que também é um dos fundadores do Schumacher College na Inglaterra. Muito bem, eu queria explicar para vocês como é que vai funcionar a nossa sessão. A gente vai ter uma fala inicial de mais ou menos uns 30 minutos do Tim Ingold, e aí depois disso a gente vai abrir para perguntas. O Tim Crabtree, que está aqui com a gente, ele vai começar com algumas perguntas para a gente ir aquecendo a troca, e aí a gente vai fazer, eu e o Luiz, que está aqui também, que também é da Escola Schumacher Brasil, o Lu vai me ajudar a gente fazendo a colheita das perguntas que forem sendo enviadas por vocês ao longo da conversa. E aí a gente vai fazendo elas pro time. Sintam-se à vontade para fazer elas tanto em português quanto em inglês. A gente vai fazendo essa tradução entre a gente aqui. E aí, para fazer as perguntas, é importante, vocês vão ver que tem um botãozinho aí que se chama Q&A. E tem o chat onde vocês podem ir trocando como já estão e podem ir conversando por lá. Se vocês quiserem mandar uma pergunta, a gente pede que vocês mandem por esse Q&A, que é Questions and Answers, perguntas e respostas, que vai nos ajudar a ir fazendo essa colheita das perguntas. Aí, por fim, Interpretation. Tem um botãozinho ali que é um globinho que vocês vão ver no canto direito. Se vocês quiserem, a gente vai a partir de agora começar a falar inglês. Se vocês quiserem nos ouvir na versão original, vocês podem deixar como tá. Se não, vocês podem selecionar a interpretação para vocês ouvirem a tradução que a Cris está fazendo em português. Por enquanto ela está fazendo ao contrário, ela já vai mudar assim que começar a falar inglês. Então, este é o momento da gente mudar para o inglês. Vou pedir para quem quiser, então, que selecione o botãozinho Interpretation em português, que quiser ouvir o áudio traduzido. Ok? Good. English now. Welcome, Tim Ingold and Tim Crabtree, who are here with us. Thank you very much, Tim, it's a great honor to be with you and to be holding this space with Brazilians. I am really delighted Tim Ingold is a professor emeritus of social anthropology at the University of Aberdeen. And he has 4 of his books published in Portuguese. Estar Vivo. I don't know if you have them with you, Tim, when we were talking, not now.
They're on the shelf, actually.
Oh, nice. So the books are Estar Vivo, ensaios sobre movimento, conhecimento e descrição, antropologia, para que serve, evolução e vida social, e mais recentemente, antropologia e como educação. They are all published by Editora Vozes. And more recently, I think in October, Tim has launched a new book called Correspondences that hasn't yet been translated to Portuguese, but hopefully it will soon. And I remember I was first introduced to you, Tim, by Tim Crabtree, who's here with us. And we were at Schumacher College at that time. He was my teacher, and I was doing a master's in economics for transition. And he was leading a module that was called New Economics in Practice. And although we were studying new economics and not anthropology, your work has been a very important reference for us throughout the whole course. And today I'm part of Escola Schumacher Brasil, and your work inspires us a lot, not only in the different courses and reflections that we invite in the courses, but I think mainly, I would say, in how we look at education and this core idea that I think you bring in your work of life as lived along lines of movements weaving together, I think speaks a lot to the way that we relate to education at Escola. So it's a great honor to have you here with us, and I will hand over to you to talk about imagination.
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for being here. I'm going to talk to the subject, and this is a sort of title: the young, the old, and the generation of now. So it's about imagination and also about education. One of the great tragedies, I think, of the modern age, which has been cruelly exacerbated and highlighted by the pandemic that we are currently experiencing, has been the separation of grandparents from their grandchildren, or let's say the rather old from the very young. Nowadays, just in the times we're living now, there are restrictions that even bar them from meeting each other. I speak personally that I've been unable to meet my own grandchildren now for a long time because it's not safe to travel. But even before all this happened this year, grandparents and grandchildren would often be living far apart in separate households and sometimes in separate institutions when old people are in care homes, and they would visit only intermittently to renew their contact. It seems as though a kind of wedge has been driven between the very old and the very young. And this wedge is the intermediate generation, the people thrust between youth and old age. And I'm going to call this intermediate generation the generation of now. The people of the generation of now are all very busy, all preoccupied with following targets and achieving goals. They're so busy with their world making, so preoccupied with the affairs of the day, that they often pay rather little attention to their elders and to their juniors. Their elders, old people, they think, have already had their place in the sun, and it's time they faded away gracefully into years of decline. So we celebrate their anniversaries every time they have a birthday, but we don't expect them actually to do anything. They should just fade back into time. Their juniors, the young people, on the contrary, well, they need to be brought up to speed to face a future that has already been prepared for them. So if you look from the perspective of the generation of now, life is shaped rather like a bell curve. It rises from the very young, you rise up to a peak somewhere in your 30s and your 40s when you're very active, 50s, 60s, and then 70s, and you gradually decline off again. So you rise up and you go down, and the now is in the middle at the peak, and the old are at one end and the young are at the other. And yet, to make a world, or if this generation is going to make a world, it has to undo or right on top of what has been made before. It has either to flatten it or to cover it over in order to impose a new layer of its own construction. If every generation of now is going to make its own world, then it has to cover over the world that the previous generation of now, who are now old people, had made before that. And their world in turn will be covered up. So we get this idea of the development of civilization or of history as a series of layers in which each generation covers over partially what was made by the previous one and will be covered over in its turn. So with each passing generation, the designs of the preceding generation crumble to dust, while the next generation in its turn is equally bound to bury the future that has been made for it. I mean, each generation is trying to make a future for the next. But if a generation is going to make its own future, then it has to override the future that the previous generation made for it. And of course, as layer is added upon layer, objects of design might survive from the past or might later be recovered through excavation, but these objects then figure as antiques. They're out of their time, and they might be preserved in a museum. You might say that every object that we make, everything that we make, is a kind of prediction. And indeed, all predictions fail. And indeed, they must fail if every generation is to have a future it can call its own. I mean, here we are in the generation of now creating a future for the next generation, but then how can the next generation have its own future unless it overrides the future we've already made for it? But then when you think about it, this kind of serial replacement of layer over layer over layer hardly amounts to a formula for sustainable living. I mean, none of these plans and predictions works out, and nor indeed is it inevitable. It makes me think that modernity's vision of progress, which is modeled like science on a history of predictive failure, of futures conjectured only to be refuted, it makes me think that this vision is really a chimera. Remember how scientific progress works. The idea is that you fashion a hypothesis, a conjecture, you test it against the evidence. Maybe it stands for a while, but eventually you find evidence to disprove it, so that the conjecture always fails to be replaced by another conjecture, to be replaced by another conjecture. Haven't you often heard on the news how scientists have made a new discovery and found that something is different, it's greater or smaller or different from what was previously thought? So we're continually adding layer over layer and destroying previous layers in the process. So we find, rather to our cost, that sustainability, the idea of actually keeping on going, is incompatible with the doctrine of progressive change, which entails the contrary, which entails continually overwriting what was done before. Now, that doesn't mean that we should resign ourselves to a council of retrogression. We shouldn't decide that, well, since the idea of progress has reached its limit, the only way forward is back. That's not what I'm suggesting. I think rather we have to find a way that aligns with the continuity of life. So that we have to think of generations in a different way. Instead of thinking of generations as cutting across the axis of time, like layers in a stack, one layer on the other, time going up or down, but the layers cutting horizontally. Instead of thinking of generations as cutting across the axis of time like layers in a stack, each on its own plane of synchrony, of now, we have to imagine generations as being laid lengthwise, overlapping in much the same way as the fibers of a rope. And imagine a rope. It's made out of plant fibers, for example, as ropes traditionally were. And each fiber in the rope is only so long. But by continually paying in new fibers as old ones begin to give out, the rope itself can wind on indefinitely. I mean, that's how ropes are made. You're winding fibers, twisting them together, and as fast as some fibers give out, you add new ones in, so that the fibers themselves, at any moment, there are always a whole lot of fibers that are overlapping along their length. So let's imagine lives in that way, not as layered over one another as in a stack, but as run alongside one another like the fibers in a rope. So although no one lives forever, the introduction of new lives as old lives pass means that life itself can continue without end. But just as the overlap of fibers as they twist around one another gives the rope its tensile strength, so also in life, the old and the young must carry on their lives together in order to lay an assured path for generations to come. So the idea is that the continuity of life depends upon those periods in which old and young are sort of twisting around one another in what they're doing, they're going along together. And indeed, throughout most of human history, this is precisely how lives have been lived. That's to say that youngsters have grown up hearing the stories and observing the practices of their elders, discovering the meanings of the stories and developing the skills of practice in the passage of their own experience, becoming then storytellers and practitioners in their turn. As they age, then the next generation will be listening to those stories that they tell and observing those practices. So throughout most of human history, this is what happened. And this is the way that each generation would learn from the generation before, by going along together, by producing together, by conversing together, by watching one another do things. But by and large, this is no longer true today. Now, if you look back, it's rather difficult to figure out what exactly happened. I mean, why isn't it true today? When did things change? What was the moment when this kind of intergenerational entwining gave way to the layer cake? What happened? It's not actually easy to fathom what happened or what the reasons for it were, but clearly they're bound up with the onset of what we nowadays rather vaguely call modernity. So you have to ask, why, when and why did every intermediate generation come to see itself as the generation of now, as this top leading generation, making the future in the present? What fired the generation of now with such world-making zeal as to tread over the wisdom of its elders and to treat its own children as creatures of nature, at ground zero of civility, in need of induction into a future they can have no hand in shaping? Because this is the way we so often think of our children now. We think of them as people, as these individuals who have no culture, that they're just natural beings. They're right at the ground zero, and they have to be educated into this future that is already prepared for them. What's for sure is that generation now has very little time either for stories or for skills. These, it says, are the stuff of tradition, preserved only to entertain the young in enactments of heritage or to indulge the old in flights of nostalgia. So when young people get storytelling, it's because they've gone off to visit a heritage park, and they get this thing delivered as a kind of experience, a commodified experience. And if old people are hearing stories or practicing skills, it's just because it's kind of nostalgic thing to do. It helps them to remember the good old days. But neither the storytelling with children or with old people contributes in any essential way to the development of society. Well, that at least is the perspective of the generation of now. Because generation now is target driven. It has its ends and its means. And yet the more expansive its ends, the more limited its means. I mean, at the moment we have a situation in which people are trying to achieve more and more and more and more with less and less and less and less. So the short-term objectives of generation now hold no promise that life can endure beyond a future already in its sights. I mean, that's to say that the generation now is planning for a target. It has this idea that not far off, we'll be able to engineer a world which will be permanent. So faced with the current environmental and climatic crisis, it dreams of a permanent geotechnological fix. Or if it can't do that, it dreams of life on other planets, so that at least the fortunate can go off and live somewhere in a colony in outer space, whilst everybody else, the bulk of humanity, deemed surplus to requirements, can then eke out a living on an irreparably damaged Earth. So my argument is that there is only one way to bring about a world with room for everyone and everything. And let's be clear, you can't talk about sustainability unless it is for everyone and everything. It's no good talking about sustainability for some and not for others, for some people but not for other people, or for some things and not for other things. If sustainability is going to mean anything, it has to be sustainability for everyone and everything, not just now, but for the future, forever. So how are we going to bring this about? And my argument is that there's only one way to do this, and that is to loosen the grip of the intermediate generation. Can we imagine a society in which young and old, who at the moment are excluded from the tasks of world making, can we imagine a society in which they're once again allowed to work alongside one another in forging the conditions of collective life? Can we imagine a society in which grandparents and grandchildren get together and actually collectively create a future? When you think about it, this is a question that has huge implications for the way we think about education, the way we think about the wisdom of the elderly and the curiosity of the young, and about the potential of their collaboration. I remember that the way we think about education at the moment is that it is reserved for a particular cohort, the generation that is about to be now, is being educated into that position. So both the very young and the very old are excluded from it. It's like the preparation of a particular horizontal band, age cohort, going up through time. And if we're to think of education instead as a process in which the old and the young come together and work out a collective future for themselves, then that challenges directly that dominant idea of what education is. Because I would argue that young children and the elderly are in touch in ways that their target-driven intermediaries are not, with more enduring rhythms of time. That is, they have a different notion of what imagination is. We tend to think that imagination is a power of conjecture. When we imagine something, we represent to ourselves a future that is already within our grasp. We can conceptualize it. Maybe it's not quite there yet, but we imagine a future, we conceive of it, we represent it. And we think of imagination as this power of representing a state of affairs that is not immediately present. So, and that is already conceptually in our grasp, even if it's not yet physically or materially so. But for young children and for the elderly, imagination is not like that. It's not about conjecture, nor is memory the recollection of a past already buried. Rather, I would argue that both imagination and memory, for the young and the very old, coalesce in a kind of beyond that is neither before nor after, but belongs to a quite different temporal register. And that's a time not of succession and replacement of one thing after another, but it's a time of pure becoming or immanence. And we could call it the time of longing. Longing is a very beautiful word, partly because it has this notion of length to it, of going along. But the thing is, it's to long for things. Is there a Portuguese word, saudade, which I think means something similar? To long for things is not to plan for the future or to wish back the past, but sort of to live on the cusp. And if you ask people what they're longing for, they can never tell you whether it's something that once was or might come in the future. When you long for something, the difference between past and future seems to collapse. It no longer appears really relevant. So to long for things is to live on the cusp, and that entails an openness to a world that is not already formed, but ever incipient, and an attentiveness to what is going on there. I just found a little passage from the writings of the great, rather intolerable Victorian connoisseur and critic, John Ruskin. Maybe a bit intolerable as a person, but he wrote some wonderful things. And I found a passage in which he's talking about seeing, looking at the sky, looking at the weather, and finding in just one instant that the generation of now would regard as purely ephemeral, it passes in a moment, and seeing a kind of eternity wrapped up in that very moment. And he's criticizing everybody for simply not paying attention to those instants. So he calls them rather pretentiously the whole chattering crowd, all these riffraff who are not paying proper attention to things. But this is what Ruskin says. Who among the whole chattering crowd can tell me of the forms and the precipices of the chain of tall white mountains that girded the horizon at noon yesterday? Who saw the narrow sunbeam that came out of the south and smote upon their summits until they melted and mouldered away in a dust of blue rain? Who saw the dance of the dead clouds when the sunlight left them last night and the west wind blew them before it like withered leaves? All has passed, unregretted, as unseen. Of course, the person who saw all this in Ruskin's account is the great painter J.M.W. Turner, because he's really talking about Turner's paintings, who captures the eternity in those single moments that simply pass unless we pay attention to them. So what we're talking about is an openness to the world, characteristic maybe of the artist, that is not already formed, but ever incipient, and an attentiveness to what's going on there. And in openness lies curiosity, and in attentiveness lies wisdom. However, neither juvenile curiosity nor seasoned wisdom hold much esteem in a system that values objective knowledge and the operations of abstract reason above all else. Indeed, within the prevailing value system that underlies our institutions of education and social care, which are dedicated respectively to preparing children for a predetermined future, that's education, and sequestering the elderly for whom this future came too late, that's social care, the innocence of curiosity is assessed as a deficiency of knowledge. Children just don't know there. And the humility of wisdom is dismissed as a deficiency of mind. So the first, the deficiency of knowledge in children, is branded by our educational institutions as ignorance. The second, the deficiency of mind amongst old people, is dismissed as dementia. Now, for the people of generation now, the idea that the demented and the ignorant might come together and forge a future is manifestly absurd. I mean, what on earth would they would say, what do you think you're doing? You know, children don't know anything, old people, they're demented. You can't put them together and imagine that they would forge any kind of future. And I'm saying that that's exactly what we should do, because it's the children who have the curiosity and the old people who have the wisdom. And both of those are different from the kind of prepackaged knowledge that we deliver through our current systems of education. So to unite wisdom and curiosity seems to me not only prudent, but necessary for the renewal of life for generations to come. And this is not nostalgia. It's not hankering for a lost past. It's not a utopian fantasy for the future. It is rather, I think, a foundation for hope. But this is where my argument, to turn hope into reality, then the old and the young must come together, turning their collaboration into a force of renewal for the common good. We got to imagine a school in which the people there would be very old people and very young people. And perhaps the tribulations of the pandemic, which drive the old and the young apart, will forcefully remind us, because of what we're missing, of the need to bring the old and the young together again. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. I would like to invite Tim Crabtree to start our conversation with you. We have a few questions coming, but Tim, feel free to start and then we can bring them, the questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Tim, for that talk. It's really very challenging, actually. I mean, although I'm, I guess, part of the generation of now, I can see myself moving quickly towards that older generation, maybe in 10 years. And it's, yeah, I can certainly see in myself, in my working life, this kind of obsession with targets and plans and strategies and sort of representations of a possible future, and losing sight of, you know, where we are here and now. And so I guess the question that I wanted to start with was to to explore a little bit more about imagination. So in another talk that you gave, you said that there is a problem with the word imagination, that we tend to think of it as a thing, and that actually we should think of it more as an activity, as a verb that we do with others. And so I guess the question that I had was that you're encouraging us to be very attentive to the present and not to be lost in our kind of plans for the future. But at the same time, the present has many problems, you know, poverty, inequality, injustice, environmental destruction. And so, of course, we are thinking about a better future. So I'm really interested in how can we, how do you see us kind of engaging in this process of imagining in a way that does address these problems and does envisage, in a sense, a better future and take us towards a better future, but that at the same time doesn't take us out of the present, doesn't take us out of that participation and that attentiveness in the now. It feels like a kind of an interesting conundrum.
Indeed, thanks. And it is a conundrum. I mean, I'm not sure that I have the solution for it, except that the ways when we say, of course, every parent would, or a set of parents would like to their children to enjoy a future that's maybe better than the one they've had, and they have dreams for their children, and that's entirely right and proper. And the first priority, I guess, is to think that there'll be a good life for my children and my grandchildren. I mean, that's the thing that really matters to people, that they can have a good life, a fulfilling life. But of course, we're being told all the time that better future means like something like a higher standard of living, more artifacts, more consumption, more disposable income, and so on. And we know that, of course, that's not possible. We can't just carry on expanding in that way, because we'd overreach the resources of the planet, or already have to a great extent. So then we have to think, well, what do we actually mean then by a good life for the generations? Because we would all wish that. We'd all wish a good life for the generations that come after us. But we need to do some thinking about what the measure of the good is. And just to give one quick example of this, where it really is awkward, we talk a lot in relation to overcoming inequality about people who are advantaged and disadvantaged. And we worry about how to make things easier for people from disadvantaged backgrounds to succeed in life. And we talk a lot about social mobility. And all of these seem so admirable on the face of it that you think to question the idea that disadvantaged people should be helped up the ladder, or that social mobility should be encouraged, to question that sounds downright elitist. And yet when you look at it, you realize that this very language of advantage and disadvantage, like up as a competition in which some rise to and the bottom. Oh. If you're trying to combat disadvantage, you can't help reproducing it. And in what's being reproduced, of course, is a meritocracy, which has its own built-in inequalities. So the very language that we use to talk about how to combat inequality perpetuates a system which ensures that inequalities will be reproduced. And so we have to find another language to talk about how to carry on with life. And I think we could perhaps go back and look at people, how it was for people through most of history and most societies around the world, that outside the ruling elites, perhaps, who had rather grand designs of their own, just take ordinary people, peasant farmers for the most part, occupying most of the world for hundreds, thousands of years. They were simply concerned that there should be continuity, that their future generations would prosper, that the farm would prosper, that fertility would be kept up, maintained, and so on. And so there was no sense of a ladder of rising up. It was simply a matter of keeping going, as it is indeed for non-human beings. They just want to keep going. And I think perhaps we could rethink our objectives about education along those lines. And we wouldn't then continually reproduce the very inequality that we claim to be trying to tackle.
Thank you. I have lots more questions, but maybe I should pass over to Bia and Louise, and they should ask some of the questions that the participants have asked.
Yes. Hi, teams.
Hi.
Well, there were some comments as well, interesting comments. There was a weaver among the participants saying about how she sees it in practice and in her practice and how she relates to it all. But I'll go straight to one of the questions. Lisandra shared a bit of her experience with her daughters and how they are interacting with their grandma, and in the end how beautiful it is, this interaction. It was a beautiful description. I won't be able to translate here, but then she goes into asking, what do you think is the role of the intermediate generation in this gathering between children and elderly people?
I mean, I think that if one went back to, again, into the past, then there wouldn't be an intermediate generation. I mean, there are older people, younger people and older people, and if you take that image of the rope, I mean, you wouldn't cut it up at all. So the intermediacy of the intermediate generation is an insertion that comes from modernity. So, I mean, obviously, at any time in history, if you have a 3-generational household, you're going to have the young kids, the parents, and the grandparents, and of course, in purely genealogical terms, the parents are in the middle, with their children on the one side and their own parents on the other. But they don't people wouldn't think about it that way if they're not dividing things up. They would simply think of these as lives that are overlapping, the grandchildren, the children, and the first parents. So something has happened that has then upset that and led that generation now, and these are people who've been through the educational system, have come out the other end, have jobs, are in employment. They're part of that structure that we now have in our society, in which people are having been educated, are of what we call working age for a particular period in their life before they go into decline. So that's the problem, and I'm sure that many parents experience this as a conflict. I mean, they would actually like to be with their children and with their own parents. They would like to be in the sort of rope model, but society forces them. They have to earn a living. They have to participate in the structures of society. So it forces them then to have to juggle work and family, for example, as we all have this problem, and for many it's a very difficult thing to do. And just one reason for that is you think, if you go back, like my wife, for example, comes from a Finnish farming family. They were simply farmers, and then when she was a girl, the work was done in the household, around the home. I mean, there would be no idea that you go somewhere to work somewhere else. So that that work is simply part of the everyday running of the household, which is the growth of the family, which is handing over to future generations. So this idea that work comes in between and drives a wedge within the life of the family is something that has arisen relatively recently in history, which means in theory it can be reversed.
Thank you, Tim. I have a question from Maria Eugenia that links some people connected to indigenous communities. So Maria Eugenia asks, Tim, an indigenous scholar and leader, Cristine Itaquá from the Guarani community, talks about imagining a society without institutions. She points out that the Western white society has its own institution for everything. School, asylums, hospitals, resting homes, companies, everyone isolated in their own space. In this sense, what is the relation between the idea of institution and your invitation to imagine a society that intertwines generations and loosens its grip?
That's a really important and difficult question. I don't know that I have the answer. It's perfectly clear that our modern society is full of all kinds of institutions, which indeed, as your questioner said, parcels up our lives in different ways. And it's also true that if you go to an indigenous society, there are no institutions like that. It tends to be the ethnographer coming from outside, trying to develop a picture of the social life of a people, might come out with an idea. They have the institution of this and they have the institution of that, but these are things that they've largely constructed. I don't know enough about the history of the idea of the institution to be able to answer this question very well. There would be sociologists who would say that you couldn't even have a society without institutions, that they're almost having institutions and being a society are almost two ways of saying the same thing. But I think that's wrong, because and one way to say it's wrong is that you can have social, the idea of society is actually relatively recent, and it's a very Western idea. The idea of social life, that's something we've always had. Indeed, not even unique to humans in any particular kind of way. So that we can talk about living socially in the sense of carrying on our lives together and nurturing one another without having to imagine that entails such a thing as a society in the institutional sense. And maybe that's where we should be trying to go. Perhaps we need a different understanding of what sociality means. Certainly there are many anthropologists who I know who would want to argue that we have to think about sociality rather than society, they might say. We have to look at the way in which people can live their lives together rather than start from the idea that there has to be a structure. And then we can see how whatever forms and structures there are things that are continually emerging and being reproduced out of the activities of people rather than things that are given in advance. Okay.
Good, thank you. Lou, do you have a question or would you like me to?
Yes, well, there are so many, but one that I think connects is connected is a question about how is Tim Ingold living and managing to meet with grandchildren during the pandemic. And also it disconnects with how do you envision this correspondence, this intertwining can happen in times of social distancing and the current restrictions we're now facing.
Well, just now I'm not meeting my grandchildren, and it's very sad. I have two families with grandchildren in. One live in Cambridge and the other in Leeds. There was a brief period when we could meet the grandchildren from Cambridge. We went to stay in a cottage, and we met them in July when things were a bit quieter and cases were low and restrictions were eased. But apart from that, we've only been able to see them on screens, and the same goes for the family in Leeds. I've not seen my grandson in Leeds for over a year now, and it's terrible. So, and I'm thinking that lots of other people must be going through, are going through the same experience at the moment, all around the world, and perhaps what I'm thinking is that it might suddenly make them realize how important are sorts of contacts that before now we might have taken for granted and not then valued as we do now. So maybe, and this will be a good thing, maybe this current situation will teach us what we always knew about how important these relationships are, and that they're not just a sort of sideshow in society, but they're actually generative of social life. They're things that if we don't have those relationships, it's not just the people saying, oh, it's awfully sad not to be able to meet your grandchildren. It's not that. It's that if you can't do it, the social life itself will kind of atrophy, will grind to a halt. We can only hope that that we'll soon be back in a place where it's possible for people to meet one another again. Because one of the disturbing features of this has been, at least in our country, there are these experts who are behavioral psychologists who are analyzing how people ought to respond to various kinds of measures and rules and predicting behavior on the basis of psychological assumptions, which probably most of us would regard as quite bizarre, a sort of extraordinarily pronounced form of individualism, in which all kinds of interactions are measured on a cost-benefit basis. It's absurd, but these people hold positions of great power and authority in the way a situation like the one we have today is being managed.
Good. I have a question from Lucas Delfino, and he says, when you mentioned, Tim, storytelling and oral traditions, you talked about the risk of art becoming entertainment, mere entertainment, to be appropriated as a commodity. How do you see the connection of storytelling with this revival of imagination?
Well, firstly, I don't see any division between stories and life. I mean, life goes into stories, stories go into life without any kind of division. So the first thing we have to recognize is that stories and life don't stand on opposite sides of a division between fiction and fact. They effectively run into one another. So that I would liken it to knitting or weaving, in which telling a story is like picking up a life and pulling it through to the present. It's like if you're knitting, you're looping the thread all the time. So you're picking up a loop and pulling it through to the present. But the strand is itself a continuous one. It's not that one might call one end of it story and another end of it life, but it's the same strand that is simply looping. And I see that's the first thing. And the second thing is about how you find the meaning of stories. It's often supposed, I think incorrectly, that stories are an educational device by which you transmit meanings and values encoded in the stories from one generation to the next. So the idea is that parents tell stories to their children. The story encodes a message about what's good or bad to do or something like that. And the children hearing the story then extract the meaning, the value that is encoded in the story. I think that is not right. That what really happens with storytelling is that the kids just listen to the stories and that's it. And then sometime later, they find themselves in a situation and they're thinking, well, what do I do now? And they remember a story and they say, that's where I am now. I'm in the situation that story was about. And then the story offers a guidance as to how to carry on. And you discover at that point, oh, that's what that story meant. And it's a meaning for you. It need not be a meaning for anybody else because everybody's particular circumstances are different. So the meanings are things that we're continually discovering in stories after they're told in the context of our own lives. They're not meanings that are sort of decontextualized and then passed off, communicated like coded messages. And I think it's the same with stories as it is with learning skills too. It's a process of guided rediscovery rather than a process of transmission.
There's a question from Luciana, if you can talk a little bit more about imagination as a verb and how this change our relationship with the idea of future. But I'll connect with another one that is saying about how traditional spaces like of popular culture are the guardians of this imagination as a verb. After all, the masters of music, dance, martial arts usually are this elder generation, and the learners are this youngster that you mentioned. And this also connects with what's the role of art in all that. So just
I could remember those three questions. Yes, I want to move from talking about the imagination as a particular cognitive faculty that we might have in our heads to imagining as a verb, as something we do. And it's not a very good word, imagination. It bothers me. I wish we had another word. And the reason why it's not the best word is because it has this word image inside it. So when we use it, we automatically think that if you're imagining something, there must be an image somewhere that's already there, a concept or an idea, which is already within our grasp mentally, if not physically. And that's not what I want to do with it. I want to think of the imagination rather as something of the way in which in our thinking, how thinking always overtakes thought. We're always falling ahead of ourselves. Not actually, in real imagination, you don't know what you're imagining. You can't put concepts to it. It's a sense always of overflowing, of falling ahead of where we are. And I think the best illustration of that is a practice we almost all do, and that is to walk on 2 feet. When you walk, you take a step forward, and that taking a step forward is actually falling over. You fall forward, and you only stop yourself from falling over because then you quickly put the next foot forward, and then you regain your balance. So when you walk, there's this alternation of first putting yourself at risk of sometimes plunging into an unknown, you don't know what, and simply trusting to the world, and then a moment of mastery in which you put the next foot down and you regain your equilibrium. So there's always this process of first submitting to the world and then establishing mastery, and then submission and then mastery with each step. And the imagination part is a submission, the placing yourself at risk of tumbling over yourself in the way that thought does. And if it didn't, we'd all be stuck. Now, it is true that in fields such as music, dance, the performing arts mostly, the masters or the teachers tend to be older people, very experienced, and teaching is often very hands-on. You know, the master might actually be holding parts of the student's body and saying, this is how I learned the cello, for example. I remember my teacher would place my hand on the bow. He'd put it like this and place my hand on the fingerboard and get the feel of the difference between the different notes. But the thing is that this kind of teaching is marginal in terms of the standard school curriculum. So that we have the basic academic subjects, mathematics, geography, English, whatever it might be, which are done in a straightforwardly academic way. And then there's this penumbra of funny subjects that are kind of optional and are slightly extracurricular and on the edge, where you do the hands-on stuff. And I've been talking with mathematicians, for example, who are fed up with this, and they say they want to bring that hands-on thing right into the center of mathematics education, because they say we're educating generations of mathematicians who have no idea what mathematics feels like. They don't know the truth of it. And so, you know, you could be making a basket in a mathematics lesson or weaving or doing something like this. And it would actually be fundamental to learning what is regarded as a high academic subject. So what we're talking about here is about taking ways of educating which are currently peripheral and moving them into the center and showing how actually you could teach any subject like this, and then you would teach it better. Now then there was a third question and I've forgotten what it was, but maybe that will do.
Oh, I think you covered, you talked about art, the role of art, and also
okay.
The other was about these traditional spaces of culture, but I think you kind of covered them.
Okay.
Tim, I have a question from Maria Cristina Ibarra.
Okay, hello.
And she says that it seems that you're proposing a critic to modern science, and amongst other things, to positivism and rationalism, and to this model of layers. She says you're proposing a correspondence between generations with different knowledges for a sustainable world. And then she asks, well, first of all, is that it? And what is the role of immanence in this process?
Okay. Yes, it is more or less it. You have to be careful because I don't want to appear anti-science. I mean, we do need science. I mean, heavens above, we're all hoping for a vaccine at the moment, and scientists are busily making one, and it would be absolutely ridiculous to say, well, we can do without them. So science has brought huge benefits to humanity, but the odd thing is that there's such a gap between what scientists actually do and the love they have for their work and the way science is institutionalized. We were talking about institutions earlier, the way it is published, the way it is rewarded, the way it is financed. There's an enormous mismatch, which is enormously frustrating for scientists themselves, most scientists are completely in love with their subject, and they just want to do it, but they find themselves within structures that treat that deep personal engagement as an irrelevance. And I think what I'm saying is that we could, not that we can do without science, or that we want some sort of touchy-feely stuff instead of science. What I'm saying is that we could do better science than we're doing at the moment if we didn't overload it with all the apparatus of positivism. If we actually regarded doing science as a way of dwelling poetically in the world, because it is. I mean, for most scientists, actually, that's what it is. But they're not allowed to say so, or to recognize that. So it's not a matter of arts versus science. I don't want that, but it's a matter of regrounding science in our habitation of a lived world. And where immanence comes into that must be the recognition that this is a world of becoming rather than a world of being. So rather than thinking, and science too needs to understand that the world, that firstly, that they are part of the world they're studying, and secondly, that this world is worlding, that it's always one that's becoming. And there's nothing new about that, because this is exactly what Whitehead said in the 1920s. Whitehead argued that we have to understand this concrescent world, a becoming world in which everything we might look at focuses this whole movement of becoming at a particular point. And he railed against what he called the bifurcation of nature, which is always separating out our minds on the one hand and the world that we thought we were studying on the other. And he said, we have to do proper science. We have to get beyond the bifurcation of nature. But at the moment, mainstream science is absolutely firmly stuck in it. So I really want to, this is very important that to say that to critique the bifurcation of nature is not to critique science, it's to rediscover science. Well, it's not to reject science, it's to rediscover science. Yeah.
Lou or Tim Crabtree, I think we have time for one more question perhaps, and then we get to close, I guess. So I wanted to ask you both if you have anything else to ask.
Go on, Tim. I think there are many questions, but we won't be able to cover anyway. So if Tim has someone to gather up.
Well, maybe just to follow that question about science, again, in another talk that you gave, you referred to Goethe and to somebody that taught at Schumacher College called Henri Bortoft. And you said something which I found very interesting about the way we tend to kind of look at appearance and the appearing of things. And anyway, it was just really just to ask you kind of what you found in that reading of Goethe or Henri Bortoft that sort of adds to what you were saying about science.
Well, it does. I often think that Goethe anticipated, was it 3 centuries ago by now, much of what I want to say now. And the way in which mainstream science reacts to Goethean science is a symptom of where the problem with mainstream science lies. I mean, it can be critical, but the sheer bloody-minded hostility towards it, the ridicule of Goethean approaches, reflects very badly on the current constitution of mainstream science. They should actually look at it seriously, not suggesting that somehow Goethe got it right and Newton got it wrong as regards color or something like that, but at least to recognize the principles of it, instead of banging on about two cultures and how to integrate the arts and humanities and the sciences. It's not that. It's about finding a way beyond that sort of bifurcation. Henri Bortoft had this lovely bit where he says that although grammatically it's correct to say it appears, philosophically it would be more correct to say appears it. I mean, what he meant by that is that to actually participate in the becoming of something is to be up there at the very moment of its appearance, to treat the world as something that is in continuous birth, and to be up, and it's like Merleau-Ponty put it in this way, it's like the artist does, opening up your eyes on the world for the very first time, every time. That's what Ruskin was getting at in the passage I read out, this idea that every time you open your eyes on the world, it's as though it was the very first time ever. And it's that moment and you're there in the appearing of things. And what I wanted to say was that I think, is the way we should understand imagination. It's not representing things, it's appearing them and being present in that moment of appearance.
It's funny, when I was teaching at Schumacher College, I think my students found my teaching of economics rather boring. But the thing that I think they really enjoyed was I introduced them to a painter called Philip Sutton, and he's now 92. And he paints still every day from 9 o'clock till 5 o'clock. And it was the most, I don't know, I think the most significant experience that they had during this kind of learning about economics, although we were learning about economics, because here was somebody who every day kind of just immersed himself in this world of becoming and never bored of drawing and painting. And still to this day, 70 years, you know, he's been painting every day for 70 years, and yet he's just immersed in this wonderful kind of immanent world. And it always struck me that that was the thing that these economic students enjoyed, you know, meeting this older person, you know, from this kind of generation that is pushed to one side, but actually he was the most inspiring person in this economics course.
Well, we have the studies that have been done not by myself, but by colleagues, where they put sort of 8-9-year-olds going into care homes, talking to people who, when they would have been younger, would have been farmers and fishermen, and are now officially suffering from dementia. But with these kids that put the implements in their hands like a net to mend, and they knew exactly how to do it, and then they would start talking, and the kids were absolutely hooked. And that's what I mean, that actually you could bring those generations together and amazing things happen.
Definitely.
Thank you so much, Tim Crabtree, for being the one who introduced me to Tim Ingold, and for the lovely classes that we have at Schumacher with paintings and working with wood. And thank you very much, Tim Ingold, for being here with us today also. It was, as usual, like really inspiring to hear your words. I wanted to also thank Editora Vozes, who's the publisher of your books in Portuguese, for this special discount that they offered everyone that joined the webinar today. I would like to thank Chris, who's probably at this very moment translating as I speak. Thank you, Chris. This is also art for me, this capacity of translating so spontaneously. Thanks, Lou, for harvesting the questions. And just to let everyone know, I'm very sorry that we didn't manage to answer all of the questions, but there was a lot of conversation, very alive here, mentioning a lot of Brazilian authors as well, that were very, very good to read. And just so everyone also knows, we're going to make this session available on our YouTube channel for those who couldn't join as well. So thank you, everyone, again. And I hope to see you soon. Thanks, Tim.
Okay.